Okay, this is for a art of record production conference in a few weeks in Denmark. Done with my colleague Paul Thompson from Leeds Beckett University in the United Kingdom. We're also both members of the Art of Record Production Association for the study of the art of record production, and we've been working together for quite some years. Interestingly enough, he's from Liverpool, so that's not necessarily where the Beatles' influence comes from. I think that's more from my interest, and he, of course, is very interested as well. We wanted to take just one example of the Beatles' work and see whether we could lay the systems model against it, but I think most importantly have a look at systems and the way that they actually work and the characteristics of systems, because I don't think we're actually talking about a single system. It depends on what scale you're talking about, of course. So that's the general background to the paper, and I just want to put some material in front of you as background to the whole study itself. I don't want to go too far into the review on creativity, the research into creativity. You can find it summarised in books like this one, The Creative System in Action. In fact, some of the background material I'll just briefly go over again that's actually in this book. And I will say it's an edited book, co-edited by myself, Janet Fulton and Elizabeth Payton, just for our international audience, by the way. I think what we need to point out is that we're not talking about common sense understandings of creativity. We're not talking about even those romantic or inspirationist understandings of creativity. They've been dealt with, and funnily enough keep being dealt with inside the research literature. I'm really talking about the research into creativity, the academic scholarly research into creativity, not the common sense assumptions about it. In 2010, the American Psychological Association, which does this on an annual basis, they review certain areas, and Division 10 in the APA is literally on creativity. So in 2010, Beth Hennessy and Teresa Amabile, Teresa Amabile is quite famous for her ideas on motivations, working at Harvard University, etc., reviewed the literature to that point of what was occurring in psychology with creativity. And I think you can broaden it out to say also in sociology as well, but that's not what they actually wound up doing. It's been studied certainly deep inside the brain at the neurological level, at terms of cognitive psychology as well, thinking processes and patterns, creative personalities at the individual level, certainly group creativity, of which we have an expert in the room here with us, contributing to Paul Paulus's book. We also have the social environment and its relationship to creativity as well, but also culture and society, and at the outermost ring, the systems approach, which coincidentally incorporates all of these. So you're not really talking about separate entities here. They made the claim that research into creativity has grown theoretically and methodologically sophisticated, but investigators in one subfield often seem unaware of advances in another. So in other words, the neuroscientists are not talking to the sociologists and so forth. So they claim that deeper understanding requires more interdisciplinary research based on a systems view of creativity that recognises a variety of interrelated forces operating at multiple levels. And I think most of us in the room would understand what's occurring there and probably would agree with what's happening. So much so that we can look at this particular model, which I think is really quite good in terms of locating, in this case, creative practices, but you could put creativity in there, processes or whatever, in the centre of a system at work. And the way that this is described, there's an agent who understands a particular set of knowledges, does something with that, rearranges or whatever. The field of individuals, institutions, etc., that understand that knowledge make some judgment about what those individual agents do. I think the interesting thing about this diagram is this question of agency. And as you'll see in a second, I don't think it's just agency as a characteristic of individuals alone. So that's kind of the background in a theoretical sense for what we're doing. I want to look at probably these last few concepts here, which are typical of systems, whether they're biological systems or they're cultural systems or whatever. We could say that this is an extension of classic Newtonian ideas, but it's leaving some of those things behind. Instead of looking at things in terms of simplicity, A plus B equals whatever, these are quite complex things that we're looking at. Instead of looking at things in terms of oppositions, black versus white, or any other sets of oppositions that you might want to put together, agency versus structure, systems insist on complementarity. So in other words, agency is actually complementing structure and whatever those other oppositions are. Non-linearity, we can't really say, well, with any success really, that A causes B and A plus B causes C in that straight line. Non-linearity is really about looking at multiple sets of factors and trying to understand not cause and effect, but emergence in that particular process. Things that emerge from a fairly complex process. Things aren't existing in isolation from anything else. They're always and everywhere interconnected. And this is the important thing that I want to talk about today. This is a question of scalability, that we're talking about systems within systems. And here's one example in the biological world. Two terms that I want to introduce you to here, and that's the notion of a holon and also a holarchy. Each one of these individual systems is a holon within this holarchy of systems. These are terms that came from Arthur Koestler. A holon is really an attempt to say, well, this is a whole in and of itself, but it's also a part of the next layer of the system up. Or to read this out, it's an aspect of systems that's both a part of something at one scale. This forest glade is part of the forest, and at the same time and at another scale is itself a whole system, just as the soil profile here is a holon of this particular system, but it itself is a system in and of itself. And the holarchy is the whole hierarchy of all of those things. Now, just to give you some visual metaphors, this film by Charles and Ray Eames, which came out in 1977, simply called The Power of 10, made well before computer animation, CGI, etc. But it starts with a picnic in a park in Chicago, and just every 10 seconds it goes to the next power of 10. So eventually you wind up out in the galaxy somewhere, and then you come all the way back down to the picnic park, and you go into the person, and then you move right down into the molecular level. And really all we're doing when we look at various systems is we're just taking a slice out of that holarchy and saying we're going to stop here and look at this and see what happens. In terms of popular culture, here's about 30 seconds of the last scene in Men in Black, and from about, on this particular clip from YouTube, about 30 seconds into about 59, you can see the car that they're driving. It just simply comes out into the space, the city space. It goes out into the globe, the world, etc. And if you move further along, it goes out into the galaxy and so on, and ignoring the end point of that particular scene. But a very similar thing. You could stop at any one of these points and look at the city, you could look at the park, you could look at the car, you could look at the planet, and so on. So this is really what we're dealing with. So, to move to Paperback Writer, you probably can't read this, but that says Paperback Writer in the centre of this particular Venn diagram, based on what Susan's work is about. That's the domain of lyric writing, that's the field of lyric writing, and that's Paul McCartney right there. We could go lower in scale, but we wind up at the biological level, so we're just going to stay at cultural here. So this is about lyrics, and I'm going to tell these stories in a second. We then move up to the next layer of this particular holarchy, this holon, which is about songwriting. And our agent here is the duo, Lennon and McCartney, and of course the domain and the field of songwriting itself. We move up another scale, we're at the point of arrangement. You can call it instrumentation, orchestration, or whatever. The song itself is really just the script for the recording. And the agents here are, of course, the collective of the Beatles and their producer George Martin, who would sit there. I'll come to that in a second. So the field of arrangement and so on. So all of those things are sitting inside one another and are part of another larger system. There's also a creative collective who worked at Abbey Road Studios in St John's Wood in London in relation to the record production of Paperback Writer as well. And that creative collective lives inside an institution called EMI Records, which had some effect on the emergence of Paperback Writer as a recording, and that of course is in relation to the field of the recording industry and the domain of recording industry, another set of knowledges and so on. And all of those industrial features, institutional features, live inside a music scene, which is a very particular definitional form from Will Straw. But that music scene, of course, in terms of this song, is part of the North Atlantic popular music field and the knowledges that go with it. And that sits inside particular society, at a particular culture, at a particular time. And this comes out of that particular thing. So you can go backwards through it, of course, or you can go forward through it. So let's go back to the lyric writing. Quite a number of stories. I'll probably get lost in them, but they're detailed in the paper at length. Paul McCartney was on his way to John Lennon's Weybridge home, but prior to this, they were backstage at the BBC. I think it was the Jimmy Savile show, although you're not supposed to mention Jimmy Savile now. But two things had occurred. McCartney was approached by his aunt. I can't remember what her name was, but it's in the paper anyway. Who was saying to him at the time, this is 1966, saying to him, you've written a lot of love songs. Can't you find anything else to write about? And that certainly played on his mind. They were backstage, all of them with Jimmy Savile and so on, and they were talking about the new song. What would it be, the new single for the new record they were making, which is Revolver. And Ringo was reading a book, and Paul McCartney was being asked this question, what's the topic of the new single? He just looked around the room and he went, it's about a book. And at that point, he kind of had the subject matter starting to occur. On the drive from St John's Wood, where his house was, to John Lennon's house in Weybridge, he was thinking about this, of course, and this happened quite a lot for them. They only had one miss in this whole process. He decided to turn it into a letter about a book, a letter to a publisher. And by the time he got to John's house, he had the lyrics in his head. He just simply went through them with John Lennon, and John said basically yes, no, as he went through each line. Then they went upstairs to the music room that John had in his house, and they put the basic music together again. So at this point, we're at the level of songwriting. This is what they produce, the basic script for the recording. So they have the lyric, they have the melody line, which is really quite plain and simple, unusual for McCartney, so you can see it's coming from, at least I can, from Lennon. Some interesting things happening there inside the structure of the song as well, in terms of the chordal structure, but I won't go too far into that. So, what happens next? Quite typically, right through their career, at least till the last third, they would bring the bare bones of the song, that script, into the studio. George would sit and listen to it, as would the other members of the band and so on, and then they would figure out what is my part in this. And George would say, well, you need to take the chorus over there, change that around, put that up there, or whatever. Can't Buy Me Love is a typical example, which started off quite slow. He takes the chorus and puts it at the front. So at this point, they're discussing arrangement or instrumentation, and they're still classically drums, bass guitar, guitar, and another guitar with vocals, etc. The guitar riff is very typical of the time, certainly of what they were writing, with Day Tripper and I Feel Fine, and what's the other song off this album? It'll come back to me, I'm hearing it in my head. Very easy to come up with a riff like that. I mean, all you've got to listen to is a melody on a guitar. This particular riff is built around a bar G chord on the bottom three strings. It's really easy to move yourself around, just picking back and forward and so on. It sounds very complex in popular music terms. If you tried to work it out on a piano, you're not going to come up with a riff like that. It's very, very much from the affordances of that particular instrument. McCartney's bass line, YouTube's really good. You can actually get the isolated tracks on YouTube of all sorts of songs, etc. But the bass playing was obviously connected to the style of song, because it's a very plain two-chord song, basically, around a kind of blues sort of structure. Very simple melody in terms that it's quite flat, which allowed the bass guitar to actually move around in a very dynamic, melodic way, which he does. Lots of other interesting things going on in it, the vocal arrangements as well. I might come back to that in a second. So, they've arranged the song, they then go into the studio to record it. Here they are on the floor of Studio 2. Just to point out a few things, this classic red desk, the REDD desk, this one up here actually, is a valve desk. Has a very particular sound to it. There's the Studio 4 track that they actually worked with. And on track 1 has gone the drums, the electric guitar and the tambourine. Track 2, which is an overdub later on, is the bass, electric guitar and the backing vocals, which tells me, I keep appearing in the literature that McCartney played the guitar riff, and which is quite possible. He did it on a number of other tracks. But if that was all layered on the one track, it's unlikely that he would have played the electric guitar and the bass. Unless, of course, they did what they did in Sgt. Pepper's and they dubbed. They would have recorded, say for instance, those instruments onto 4 tracks, dubbed it down to 1, and then started again, dubbed those 3 down to the 2 and started again, and so on. So it is possible that they're doing that. What is this creative collective contributing to the recording? I'd just point you to this guy, Jeff Emmerich, who had joined them just at this point after Norman Smith had left as their engineer, and this guy, Ken Thompson. So he's a record engineer. In EMI you have balance engineers, you have mastering engineers and so on, but he's a tech person. He's basically there to make sure that the gear works and it runs and so on. This box, colloquially known in the studio as a white elephant, they weren't in the early stages using headphones to monitor themselves. They would the playbacks of, say, that first track would come back through this speaker and they would play along with the speaker. Classically, you can hear that box on Yesterday, and Yesterday has a vocal part that sounds like it's been double tracked, but they're actually just picking up the speaker box through McCartney's main vocal. At this point, and I'll come to the sort of recordings that they were listening to at the time, they wanted to really push the bass guitar forward, because UK recordings simply didn't have the quality of the bottom end that they were hearing in the US. And Jeff Emmerich came up with the idea, and if you know about recording gear, speakers and microphones are very, very similar. They're both transducers. They change acoustic to electric energy, and in the other case electric to acoustic energy. And the principle is exactly the same, moving coil through a magnet and so on. So they just reverse wired this speaker cabinet, placed it right up against his own, McCartney's own bass cabinet, 15-inch speakers, so lots of bass on the exterior of the speaker. And the hope was, of course, that they would get a much richer bass sound, which they did do. So Jeff has the idea. Ken Thompson actually puts it into practice. He says, well, we can do this with this particular speaker box, and that satisfies what Emmerich was after. The sounds that are occurring on the recording are not necessarily the responsibility of Paul McCartney or John Lennon and Paul McCartney or the Beatles or of George Martin, but they most certainly are of the technology and these particular people as well. So they're all contributing something to the creation of that particular recording. You can see at the institutional level with EMI records that these people also had something to do with the way Paperback Writer emerges at that particular point in history. You can see the culture in the photographs. You can see they're all male, of course. You can see they're still having cups of tea with biscuits in the canteen at Abbey Road. You can see the commissionaire here in uniform, full uniform and so on. Here's the board of directors deciding, should we buy an 8-track recording machine or should we stay with our 4-track recording machines? This is in 1966. They eventually did, and the first album of the Beatles that was recorded on the 8-track was Abbey Road, and it has a particular transistorised sound to it, so the thing changes at that particular point. So it's a very particular culture that they're working inside. To give you some idea, here's Len Wood. He's the managing director at that particular point. Of course, he's here with his star performers, with his parlophone producer here, and Brian Epstein, their manager, with all of their gold records and so on. So they're contributing something to the financial of the record company. But Len Wood, if he decides not to put money into the Beatles recordings, this Paperback Writer does not happen. None of their recordings happen. Of course, there is a relationship there between the commerce and so on. Which gets us to the music that they were listening to. And you can see it, certainly not all of it, but there's some of these things are quite significant in terms of what they're doing. A lot of material from the United States. Certainly the English bands are doing certain things at this time. For instance, the Animals release, We've Got to Get Out of This Place, which has a very particular structure to it. Some of you might know it from the Angels version. But tunes like Summer in the City, Hot Town, Summer in the City, and so on, Monday, Monday, these were all current at the time. Otis Redding's soul album, so they're actually starting at this point, well, they just started actually starting to listen to R&B and soul. They'd been listening to Motown for quite some time and incorporating that music into what's going on. James Jamerson, as a bass player who played sessions on these with a house band called the Funk Brothers, highly influential on what McCartney was doing, as was Carol Kay, the session bass player for the Beach Boys. She was an unsung hero, of course, of that whole particular band, that recording scene. But also what was going on here in terms of the sounds coming from artists like Sam and Dave with Hold On I'm Coming and so on. This group in particular, this British group, the Spencer Davis group, very much connected to what these bands were doing, but in the British way, as were the Animals. And of course you've got what became known as psychedelia later on with the Kinks, with Sunny Afternoon and Dedicated Follower and Fashion and so on. These are all swirling around inside McCartney's head, and he's the biggest bowerbird, as is John Lennon. John Lennon really loves the bass guitar on this recording, and on this recording, and on this recording. And it's he that suggests they want that big, fat bass sound, which then Emmerich picks up, and then Ken Thompson puts into operation. So there's a particular set of things happening here, and it's a relationship between particularly the US and the UK. And at the socio-cultural level, there's all sorts of other things going on as well. So the summer of 1966 is a particularly positive time in the UK. Lots of sunshine, quite literally, lots of sunshine. They've just come off the back of beating West Germany in the 1966 World Cup. So there's a lot of celebration going on. Here's the fashion styles that make their return every so often, but also against the background of the Vietnam War. Particularly this becomes the soundtrack of that period going on. Establishment, new wave basically, but also against the Cold War and nuclear testing, which became, particularly for Paul McCartney and Jane Asher, who was going out with at the time, became a real problem, and they were talking to a lot of people about it. And here's a paperback from that particular period, and you can see all of these things being included in those particular stories. So I don't think it's unusual. Oh, one other thing that you need to know about Paperback Writer, which will take us all the way back to McCartney. At that point, there wasn't a great deal of longevity in popular music. Most artists were expected to last for 2 or 3 years. They'd well and truly had their 2 or 3 years of fame at that point, and both Lennon and McCartney were scouting around what could they do inside the music industry that would give them some sort of career. And of course they wanted to be songwriters, and they were doing that. They were writing songs for other people and so on. And in many ways you could say that the lyrics are just an extension of, at that particular point, McCartney's own thinking about what will I want to do. Well, I want to be a published songwriter. He just transfers that across to, dear sir or madam, won't you read my book? It took me years to write, won't you take a look? Etc., which is a letter, an epistolary form to a publisher of novels, etc. Which gets us to this thing, which is the label of the single itself. And in many ways you can see all that preceding material located in some way on this particular label. 1966, made in Great Britain at that particular point. It's a Parlophone recording, which is a subsidiary label of EMI. It's certainly a vinyl recording at 45 RPM. It's subject to all of the legals as that particular society has in place. Northern Songs is their publisher. I didn't mention Dick James, but he's also important in this as well. So you can almost see inside the label itself this British pound, which is the symbol for Parlophone at that particular point. You can almost see that whole story written on the label right there. And I find labels quite fascinating. So that's how Paperback Writer emerged as part of that system. And you can read all about it there, and there, and there, and there. And thank you.